Good afternoon. Today, on the eve of the 74th anniversary of VE Day, which ended the war for many Europeans, we have Marina Kirsch as our distinguished guest speaker. Marina has spent many years researching and writing the story of her family from the Axis side of World War II. Marina chronicled her family struggle in Latvia, occupied Poland, and in Germany. Her book, Flight of Remembrance, was an award-winning finalist in the narrative nonfiction category of the 2012 USA Best Books Award. In recent years, Marina has been speaking at engagements such as ours today in order to preserve the lessons from World War II. Marina is also a New Hampshire Humanities to Go speaker and is currently a speaker for Toastmasters International, a nonprofit educational organization. Please help me in welcoming Marina Kirsch.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
Today, on the 74th anniversary of VE Day, that is the day where the German forces finally surrendered unconditionally to Allied Supreme Commander General Eisenhower. I would like to thank all of you for attending, and thank you to Alvirne High and especially to Jeff and Brett for organizing this event. I'd like to start with a question. Is there value in stories from both sides of a world conflict, or only in those from the side of the victors, especially if they vanquished a brutal regime that directly or indirectly caused the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide? I had to wrap my mind around those figures. If you buried 5 people a day, it would take you over 27,000 years to bury 50 million, and over 38,000 years to bury 70 million. World War II was a cataclysm without precedent. Today you'll hear a different kind of World War II story from the Axis side of the war, and it includes 2 German veterans, my father and my grandfather. The 2 main protagonists, my parents, Rolf Dutzman, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lilo Wasul, the young woman that he met in 1940 Berlin. Now in 2004, before I wrote my book, I actually encountered a comment that gave me pause for thought. Someone said, "But it's a story about Nazis." I thought, yeah, that had to come sooner or later. This despite the fact that no one on either side of my family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler. And yet, I had to ponder whether the timing would ever be right for a story about German people during World War II. I came to realize, though, that there is therapeutic potential in a story that gives a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy, rather than denying or burying the past. Maya Angelou once said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need never be lived again." I'm in agreement with that. In order for that to happen, don't we need to know something about people who were on the other side? I would like to mention my 3 main objectives in my presentations. What can you gain from Flight of Remembrance, a story from the other side of the war? First, you'll hear how love and dreams, aided by faith in God, yes, in God, can prevent despair and actually promote survival through adversity. Our dreams of today are the hope for tomorrow. Second, you'll find out a little bit about what it was like to live through war waged on home soil on the losing side, something that only happened here in the US during the Civil War. So none of us are familiar with that. And third, you'll have to help to preserve World War II and Holocaust memories, because I touch on the latter as well. Some people who had relatives, ancestors who lived in Europe during the war are able to recover part of their family's story as a result of Flight of Remembrance, and they have thanked me for that. I'd like to find out now what stories we have in this room. First of all, I know looking at you, there are no World War II veterans in this room. But a couple of months ago, 2 of them showed up at a presentation I held in Maine. I was so delighted. But are there any other veterans in the room? Wartime, peacetime, anytime, any branch of service, any country? Yes. Where did you serve?
Germany.
In Germany. How long ago?
71 to 74.
71 to 74. Well, thank you very much for your service. Is he the only veteran? Another veteran, yes.
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Which years?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Late 60s, early 70s. Any others? The next question, and thank you for your service, by the way. The next question is, did any of your ancestors, you're all too young again, live in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Japan, Philippines, North Africa, or any place where the war was fought on home soil? Okay, we have quite a few. Let's start here in front. Where were your ancestors?
My grandmother was in France.
In France.
My great-grandfather was actually a soldier on the German side.
A soldier on the German side. Was he in the German army?
I believe he was in the Navy.
He was in the Navy, okay. And
my parents had to leave Latvia in 44 because the Soviets were coming in. And so my mother was bombed by the Russians as they left the family farm and had to get their way all the way over to the other side of Germany, to the western side, into the displaced people's camps. So I am essentially a first-generation American, and I do have Latvian and American citizenship.
thank you very much. This is Guntis Gonkarovs. He is a fellow author. He has written quite a few books, and as you may have heard, his mother and family fled Latvia in 1944. As you'll find out, my family fled before that, when the going was much easier, I suspect. There were a couple of other hands. Yes?
My grandmother was in Great Britain.
Great Britain.
I had a great aunt who was running from the Germans from Ukraine and went all the way up to Germany and then out to the U.S.
Wow. Well, we have quite a few stories in the room, and there will be more time later for some discussion. Thank you all very much. Now I'd like to tell my family's story in a nutshell, as shown on the cover of my book, Flight of Remembrance. Oh, first, how many of you have heard of New Hampshire Humanities? Quite a few of you. New Hampshire Humanities is such a wonderful organization here in the Granite State. They help to provide quality programming to nonprofits all across our state. We are very privileged, and I feel privileged to be a New Hampshire Humanities presenter. Thank you to Alvirne High for allowing an event that is open to the public. So now the story of my family in a nutshell. The man with the helmet, my father, Rolf Dutzman, after fleeing Latvia and being drafted into the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. I left the eagle and swastika on his helmet because they are the only element that identifies this as a story from the Axis side of the war. I felt that was important. In the background behind the people is a ruined family home in Berlin. You will see a clearer picture of that later. Here, my parents, Ralph and Lilo, wedding day, November 1944. And a little higher up, my older brother Ingo, age 2, born in post-war Bavaria. Above the title, a small icon, which is an illustration that I did of my father flying a pre-World War II Latvian glider. That little icon represents 2 things to me. First of all, my father's overarching goal for a career in aeronautical engineering. He wanted to further the field of aeronautics. Some of you probably have dreams for your lives. Pursue those dreams, hold on to them, and let them be a guiding light for your life. But the second thing that that little icon represents is my own quest to gain a higher and a wider perspective on World War II through the researching, the writing, and now the retelling of my family's story. And thanks to audiences like you, I continue to gain insight into the war. And finally here, the award symbol from the 2012 USA Book Awards. The book won a finalist award in narrative nonfiction. How many of you have heard of the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Wow, quite a few. This is a very well-educated audience, I can tell. Frankl was a Viennese Jew who suffered through the concentration camp system during World War II. He survived. He found meaning even at Auschwitz. And after the war, he founded the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, known as logotherapy, which is focused on finding meaning in life. For my parents and grandparents, even though they never met Frankl, never knew about his books, which were only published later, they also found a meaning in their lives that helped them to visualize life beyond the cataclysm that was coming. Let's go back now to 1924 Latvia. My father, Rolf, is a little boy, age 5, with his mother, Maria, his little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst, in Latvian military uniform. Latvia was a free republic between the world wars. Prior, it was part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and later, it would become part of the Soviet Union. For now, it is a free republic, and Ernst had a dream too, my grandfather. His dream from a young age was to be captain of a ship bound for America. But that would not be possible during World War II. My father, Rolf, like many young people all over the world in the 1920s and 30s, wanted to be part of the exciting new field of aeronautical engineering. By age 14, in this photograph, he had been building model gliders for years from plans in German and American magazines, and he could already speak, read, and understand English fairly well, a skill that would save his life toward the end of the war. And by age 18, shown here with a Latvian National Award-winning glider, he is already building his first full-size motorized plane and a full-size manned glider. Here he is flying that glider. He was with a group called the Izargs. Have you heard of them, Guntas? Yeah. The Izargs were the closest thing that Latvia had between the two world wars to a National Guard. But they were permanently disbanded upon takeover by the Soviets in 1940. Now you'll see something interesting in this photograph. You recognize the dress? My grandmother Maria hand-tailored and embroidered the dress that I have on in the early 1930s in Latvia. She later altered it to fit me. I was about your age, and miraculously, it still fits. I'd like to show you the sleeves, which I feel are the most beautiful feature of the dress. The jewelry, and by the way, the embroidery pattern was identified by a costume museum in Riga as an authentic Latvian design, which I was delighted about because my grandmother was not Latvian. The jewelry is called a kurzem brooch. It was from the southwestern part of Latvia on the Baltic Sea where the family lived. We have an incredible number of treasures dating back to the World War II time period. Other beautiful needlework, but also photographs, documents, letters, memorabilia. We are truly privileged. But it was the family history written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, during the early 1990s that fully impressed upon me what a treasure my family's story is and encouraged me to share it. What is there about your personal past, or maybe your family's past, that should be preserved and shared? Think about that, because preservation is a treasure for future generations. You might not think about that much until you get to be in your 30s and 40s, but believe me, you will think about it. Which country was most feared across most of Europe during World War II and also World War I, especially by people of German heritage? Who knows the answer? Just shout it out.
Germany.
Well, no. We're talking about which country was feared by German people.
US?
No. Anyone else want to venture a guess?
Great Britain. Great Britain.
Great Britain? No.
Soviets.
Yes. Most people still called it Russia, but it was the Soviet Union, wasn't it? Russia. A vast country with an incredible heritage. In October 1939, my father Rolf had just started studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Riga when an ominous phone call came from my grandfather Ernst, his father, telling him to come home immediately, and life would never be the same again. A Soviet takeover was imminent, and for people like the Dutzman family, who were of German heritage, they were at a greater risk for deportation or execution under a Soviet takeover. My grandfather Ernst especially, shown here at a very young age of 19, he had served as a Tsarist Russian officer during World War I, a Latvian officer for the Free Republic of Latvia between the World Wars. He was at risk for that alone, but he was also an outspoken anti-communist, and everyone knew it. The only country, though, accepting people of German heritage from other parts of Europe, and they were scattered all over the face of Europe, by the way, not just in Germany, not just in Austria, they were in just about every country. But the only country that would accept them if they needed to flee was Nazi Germany. At this point in time, late 1939, the Dutzman family had not yet passed a verdict on Hitler and the Nazi regime. They didn't know all that we know today. However, the Stalin regime had long been recognized as a regime, a brutal and oppressive regime with little respect for human life. And so it was that they decided they would have to flee to save their lives. They could have given in to all this. Despair, hopelessness. But instead, they allowed their love for each other and their dreams for the future, that guiding light, to guide them into the path that might save their lives. This photograph of Rolf, his mother Maria, and his sister Ruth was taken in late 1939, not too long before they fled, along with Ernst and 50,000 other Latvians of Baltic German heritage from Latvia to Germany. Now, Guntis's family didn't flee until much later. The going was harder then. Their sense of what was to come, their sense of foreboding, was chillingly accurate, because after the Soviet takeover, Latvian officers who failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of other Latvian citizens were either executed or deported. Now, Latvia, along with many other Eastern European countries, but especially, I think, the Baltic states and Poland, suffered wave upon wave of tragedy. So in 1940, the Soviet takeover. In 1942, the German takeover. And during that time, 75,000 Jews were murdered in Latvia alone. This photograph was taken from German military archives, since, of course, my family, thankfully, had already left by this time. And as history would play out, a third brutal takeover in 1945, when the Soviet troops swept back through the Baltic states and other parts of Europe again. Each time, mass executions, mass deportations. And by the way, you could not be neutral. You had to choose sides. And in general, you chose the side that you felt would deliver you from death. That was the sad fact during those times. And then when the other side swept through again, most likely you would be exterminated. A map of late 1939 Europe, already changing exponentially by this time. The war started, of course, September 1st of that year. In the light tan, Germany proper, including East Prussia off to the right. In the darker tan, I hope you can see this, the countries that Germany had already annexed, including the former Austria, and here, half of the former Poland. The other half taken over in red by the Soviet Union, partly off the map. Two other countries involved in the family story, at the bottom, in orange, Switzerland and Slovakia. Further north, the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, the family lived north of a larger city of Liepaja in a military enclave called Kara Osta. And it was there that my grandfather Ernst was head of a department in a munitions laboratory on the Baltic Sea. When the family fled in December of that year, they went from the capital city of Riga via the dotted line to an island in the Baltic Sea called Uzedom. Now, as soon as their ship left the port city, they and 2,000 other people on board became people without a name, people without a national identity, and people with no idea what their fate would be under the Nazi regime. They sailed into the darkness of uncertainty, and at the same time, the entire world was plunging into darkness and destruction. They were sent first to occupied Poland. Did you see that line? To the city of Posen. That was their greatest fear, that they would be sent to occupied Poland, because that was the most dangerous place in all of Europe at the time. Here is Rolf on the train. His greatest fear actually was not even occupied Poland. For him, it was that the regime would draft him immediately, instead of allowing him to finish his aeronautical engineering education. And for his mother Maria, at the left of this photograph, she's also pondering what the family's fate will be. Their immediate fate in Posen, they were housed in crude, unheated barracks. They had dismal rations, and they slept on straw on the floor. But that too did not last long. From Posen, they were sent even farther east to Litzmannstadt or Lodz. Notice how close they are getting to the Soviet threat. But my grandfather Ernst was so technically skilled that there was no work to be found for him there, and soon the regime sent the family to Berlin. And it was there, in 1942, the regime by that time, fully aware of Ernst's technical skills, that they drafted him as a major into the Wehrmacht, the German army, and sent him back up to that island where they began their German sojourn. How many of you have heard of Peenemünde? Okay, one person. How about Werner von Braun? Okay, quite a few more people. My grandfather was sent to the island to work at Peenemünde and to train for V-2 rocket inspection under Werner von Braun, the rocket genius. There are many other locations and routes on this map. One other one I will mention. When that facility was bombed in August of 1943, the regime determined after that they needed a safer place to mass produce the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, which were their so-called secret technology and secret weapons. They chose a place in the heart of Germany, here near a town called Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains, an area that had not yet been bombed by the Allies. And it was there that my grandfather Ernst was sent in February of 1944 to work the last 14 months of the war before the facility had to be evacuated. Did you see that little dot? Little dot is flying in. That is the city of Danzig or Gdansk, which is in a small corridor of German-occupied Poland. I'm going to be mentioning that briefly when I talk about my father's continuing education. Now to the other side of the story. My mother, Lilo, is a little girl, age 2, with her parents, Gertrude and Walter Wassul. She was born and raised in Berlin, had a different perspective on Hitler and the Nazi regime than Rolf and family did coming from Latvia. She saw some positive things at first, but then she saw sinister developments. And by the time she was in high school, a young teenager, she refused to join the League of German Girls, which was the same as the Hitler Youth for boys. She said, they're sinister, fanatical, and atheistic, and I want nothing to do with them. However, a year after she graduated, unfortunately for the young people still in school, all young people were forced to join the Nazi youth groups. Here, Lilo is 19. She also has a dream for her life. The goal for her life was a harmonious, loving, and supportive home life and marriage, something that didn't exist in her growing up years because her parents had a rocky marriage that ended in divorce when she was only 13 years old. Lilo is about to meet Rolf at this point, and her dream too would commence. The city of Gdansk in Poland, once a free city, it was no longer. But Rolf had received word that he would be able to continue his education here, and he did for about a year and a half. By this time, in 1939 already, the city was completely taken over by Nazi ideology. And Rolf, who had hoped that the war would be long over before he graduated, received his draft notice the same day that he received his diploma in late 1941. And he commenced his service in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, in January of 1942. Now, at this point in time, there are two words that are in the news a lot. It was where no German military personnel wanted to be sent. And those two words were the Eastern Front. But of course, in German, it's one word, it's Ostfront. Stories that were horrifying beyond belief were filtering back from the snowbound vastness of the Russian countryside. It could be that Rolf was reading one of those stories when he was home on leave. Fortunately, Rolf was only sent to the front at the very end of the war. His technical skills, get this everybody, your education is important. His technical skills shielded him from the front. He was trained on model gliders, on full-size gliders, received numerous certifications in flying gliders. In addition, he taught airplane design and aerodynamics. And then finally, as the war was progressing, he agreed to train to be a navigator, hoping the war would be over before his training was done. And indeed, it almost was. He was never forced to fly any combat or bombing missions against the Allies, I am happy to report. Picture this. 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany during the war. 363 air raids against Berlin alone. Who knows which two cities in Germany suffered even worse bombing in terms of the intensity, the number of bombs, and the resulting firestorms? Anybody? Yes.
I think Dresden was one of them.
Absolutely Dresden. So Dresden was in the eastern part of Germany. There was another city in the northwest. Anybody know? Hamburg. Yes, the bombing in those two locations in particular was horrifying. Yes, Berlin sustained a lot. The family home here that I used for the cover of my book in the background, this photograph was taken in March of 1944, and also the interior. The only reason we have these photographs is because Rolf took bombing leave to go and inspect the damage. Now, Lilo's home was also destroyed. She and her mother lived in Berlin, and her home was destroyed one floor at a time until finally the roof and walls destroyed, windows shattered, pipes burst, and water flowing into the apartment. She and her mother Gertrude could no longer live there. But the word from the regime was, no working person leaves Berlin. They were persistent, though. They kept inquiring. Love and dreams. They finally received permission to move out of the beleaguered city to a small town that never did experience bombing during the war, and that perhaps saved their lives. On a sad note, though, all of Lilo's family members, with the exception of her mother, remained trapped in the eastern part of Germany that became East Germany under Soviet domination, and she never saw any of them again. That is one of the things that happens when you live through war waged on home soil. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather Ernst in the underground installation of Mittelwerk, where the V-1 and the V-2 rockets were mass-produced, and where he worked as chief inspector of the V-2. Grandpa never talked about it. We knew what his role was, we knew what his title was, but long after his death, when I started writing my book, I had to do a lot of research via magazines, post-war transcripts, books, and other sources. Imagine my dismay when I found out that there was a horrifying, brutal slave labor camp right outside the gates of this installation. You can maybe imagine the thoughts that went through my mind and the sense of dismay that I felt that my grandfather had worked in a place like that. I found out that in his department, he was in charge of 200 Army and civilian engineers and 3 inmates. I wondered what else I would find. I read quite a few books, some written by inmates, including one written by a former inmate, a Frenchman, who said that the inmate Yuri Benish forged a friendly relationship with Major Dutzman of the Wehrmacht. That was my grandfather. And then later, I received post-war transcripts from Yuri Benish, the Czech inmate, and I found out that not only did he and my grandfather have a friendly relationship, but my grandfather saved his life on more than one occasion when the SS wanted to interrogate him for sabotage. Yes, indeed, he was committing sabotage. He was falsifying paperwork, and he was hiding the paperwork under the floorboards beneath his desk. Had they interrogated him, they would have found everything, and he would have been executed in the underground tunnel system. Perhaps my grandfather, too. It was risky for both of them. Nevertheless, as his granddaughter, I am gratified to know that. I also found out that he shielded the other 2 inmates in his department as best he could, but under dire circumstances. 2 regrets on my part. My grandfather Ernst probably never knew that Yuri Benish survived the war. That makes my heart ache. And the second thing is that my grandfather will be forever identified as a perpetrator just for having worked in this place. One of the underground tunnels as it looks today. In late 2011, my husband and I visited there. We received a tour from the director of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp memorial that now stands at the site of the former camp. Today, it is a place that does not commemorate the rocket technology whatsoever. It only commemorates the inmates who toiled and died there. In late 1944, a love story was playing out in the midst of destruction and chaos and disaster that would span over 70 years and across 2 continents. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, got married on November 24th, 1944. They did not have any idea that the worst times for German civilians and military personnel were still ahead. Within 6 months after these photographs were taken, Rolf and his father Ernst would both be taken prisoner of war, and Lilo and her mother Gertrude would be forced to flee the Soviet troops more than once. Perhaps worst of all, for over a year, neither one of them knew if the other was still alive. Do you think that would make you appreciate your relationship if that happened to you? March 1945, Dad was in Slovakia in between assignments. He took a cute little hostage, took care of this little kitten for a while, but disaster was about to strike again. Shortly after this, he and tens of thousands of other military personnel in Germany were sent to the front. However, with the war almost over, no personal weapons left to be given out, they weren't forced to serve there for long. Soon, their unit was told to disperse, and they understood what that meant. That meant desert, flee the front, walk homeward if you can, and if you even know where home is anymore. He and his unit, the other men, maybe 10 men or so, walked cross-country homeward, Rolf 160 miles cross-country in late winter, to arrive, he hoped, where home used to be. Now that is one of the other things about war fought on home soil, is that not only military personnel, but homes and families are also at risk. Between this photograph and the next one, I'm actually leaving out the most dramatic and climactic part of the story for you to read about yourself in the book. It would take me way too long to explain it, and it is an amazing and synchronistic story that you almost have to read about to really judge for yourself how amazing the sequence of events was, most of them orchestrated by my mother's mother, Gertrude, who is a major mover and shaker in this story. I could write a book about her alone. We're jumping now to post-war Bavaria. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, in this picture, which is one of my favorites of them of all time, they are smiling down at their post-war dream, my brother Ingo, shown here at age 2, and then at age 3, and lo and behold, he was the only German child documented to have grown a tail. That was sewn onto his overalls by my grandmother Maria, who also made this dress. It was a foxtail, probably from one of her coats. She had some fancy clothes back in those days. This is a good point for me to interject what it's been like to be a child of German people, people who were in Germany during the war, who were in Germany at the time that the Holocaust occurred, that the death camps were running. For a long time, growing up and way into my 30s and 40s, I assumed that everyone had to have known everything. But over many years of research, reading, including the accounts of Jewish people who were hiding right in full sight in Germany, posing as non-Jews, and also post-war transcripts and books and so on, and talking with my parents as well, I came to realize the truth is not nearly so simple. First of all, what did people know? They knew that concentration camps existed. Everyone knew that. It was where enemies of the regime were sent. What they didn't necessarily know is who were those enemies. They didn't know necessarily that ordinary dissenting citizens and even pastors and priests might be sent to camps and murdered. In addition, the Nazi regime did not publicize the killings. Neither did Allied reports mostly during the war. And if you were foolhardy enough to even listen to Allied reports, you were in danger of going to a camp yourself. Your own family members might report you for listening to the BBC, the Voice of America, or Radio Moscow. The death camps also, let's not forget, were in occupied Poland. Of course, the camps in Germany proper, like the one where my grandfather was forced to work, were bad enough. But here's another complication. How many people actually knew about the genocide? The camps where my grandfather was forced to work, by and large, did not have Jews, did not have gypsies, did not have communists. The people who were sent there were mostly partisans and resistance fighters from the countries with which Germany was at war and who had been captured. So did even my grandfather know? I suspect he probably did, and here's why. The people who most certainly knew were people in the upper echelons of the military, the government, hospitals and institutions, the church. Many leaders in the church in Germany were aware of what was going on, and the church was bitterly divided. So the opponents of Hitler within the church were the ones who were arrested, and many of them were also executed. My parents, Ralph and Lilo, were shocked and horrified to find out about the industrial-scale genocide after the war ended. And that is the story that quite a few people in Germany give. If you sign my mailing list, Brett, could I ask you to pass this around perhaps? With an email address, I will send you my suggested reading list. And on that list is a book entitled What We Knew by Johnson and Rubin. They interviewed thousands of people. And their final estimation is that about 1/3 of the German people knew everything. About 1/3 heard rumors or saw something, but they couldn't quite substantiate what was going on. And about 1/3 were completely clueless. So I believe it came as a bitter shock to many people in Germany after the war. Germany, after the war, was a humanitarian disaster site, inundated by 14 million hungry, homeless, and destitute refugees. By comparison, today's refugee crisis is nothing. Perhaps this is one reason why Germany has accepted so many. It's on their conscience. And not only refugees were hungry and starving, everybody, the German citizenry as well, was starving, and so were German POWs. Perhaps the greatest threat, though, especially for my family, was the Soviet threat that was still hanging over their heads. They were still on the doorstep of the Soviet Union, and another takeover could take place at any time. My family was fortunate to be able to immigrate to America in late 1951. So I'd like to pause here and ask, do we have any immigrants or refugees in this room other than me? Nobody. How many of you have parents or grandparents who came from another country? Oh, we have quite a few hands up now. Thank you very much. In December of 1951, on a cold, foggy day, my father, Rolf, my mother, Lilo, 8 months pregnant, and my older brother, Ingo, took their leave of Germany. They traveled across a rubble-strewn countryside and arrived in Switzerland only to find that their flight to America would be delayed overnight because of the fog that covered all of Northern Europe. But the next morning, on the brink of my family's odyssey to the New World, I decided to make my entrance into the post-war Old World, and I chose a neutral country. What could be better? I completely derailed their immigration plans by my premature arrival. They had to raise more money. Not even infants could fly for free, even back in those days. But we did eventually arrive in the little town called Wakarusa, Indiana, where our generous sponsors lived. We are forever indebted to the people of the little town of Wakarusa, a little farming community of about 1,200 people who sponsored us for immigration. My brothers and I here, my younger brother born here in the States, the only natural-born citizens, we are in the backyard of the first house that my father rented after he got his first job. I paid a visit on a couple of occasions to Wakarusa. I spoke there in 2012 and again in 2015 and 2017, and also other communities around that area. And we have also reestablished connections with people who remember us from the early 1950s. I was so impressed with the dedication and the sacrifice of the people of Wakarusa that I dedicated my book not only to my parents, Ralph and Lilo, but to the people of Wakarusa. Remember my grandfather Ernst's dream to be captain of a ship bound for America? Well, here he is after the war. Obviously, my parents and my brother were still there at the time, but in 1952, February, Ernst and my grandmother Maria boarded a ship bound for America. And no, he was not the captain. But the beauty of it is that with his skills no longer tied to any world regime, he finally became the captain of his own destiny. The family in 1958, around this time, we were privileged to become naturalized citizens, all except for my younger brother at lower left. And right around this time, in an incredible twist of fate, my father Rolf and my grandfather Ernst were both hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where my father was head of a team of engineers that designed and built components of the Saturn 1B rocket. Those were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. So what amazes me is how that dream, I talked about a dream and a vision for your life. Establish it now, follow it, live it, because that dream not only wasn't derailed by war and hardship and disaster, but it actually expanded into a key role for Rolf in the emerging U.S. space program. After retirement, though, he had to forge new meaning in his life, and he decided that he would share his aerospace enthusiasm and his skills with children and adults all around the Granite State. Here he is with a group of young astronauts in Alton, New Hampshire in the early 1980s, and then here in 2011 with children at the Kensington Summer Camp who have built their model rockets and they're about to have a rocket launch. For over 30 years, my dad was an avid volunteer. My parents' love story. It's not just about surviving war and disaster. It's as much about finding meaning, cherishing a dream, and living a life of faith in God as it is about survival. And I encourage all of you, each of you, find that gem of meaning in your life that you can use to share with others and inspire them. Finally, in closing, this photograph from a 2013 model rocket launch is a reminder that what we share with others lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. And may we each work today to forge a tomorrow where everyone can live out their dream and their life's purpose. Thank you.